Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Ricardo Mojica. I am pleased to accompany you once again in this class of 2021. And as always, thank you to Carlos Mairao, the representative of Contamac, who has been very interested in these academic events worldwide today, where we will talk about contact lenses, technology, and handling. Today I want to talk about what are the basic adaptations in rigid contact lenses. And we see today that we have a lot of changes in the materials. The materials have caused a lot of designs to be generated differently, and there are many number of contact lens designs for different type of corneas, different adaptations. But I see that sometimes we forget the basics, and the basics in adaptation such as the principles or the philosophical principles. And the idea today is to come and talk to you about these concepts. As I say, they are concepts, they are criteria, they are philosophies, that at no time do I want to say that one is better than another, or that they should work like that. That we see today in this matter of adaptations, we have alternatives, too many alternatives to adapt patients with irregular corneas, or corneas that we could say only with refractive effects, such as myopia, astigmatism in short, within which it is part of the discussion that I bring to talk a little bit about this management to the patients of these types of corneas. And when we talk about adaptation of rigid contact lenses, we have to go back to the criteria we spoke, and that they always have taught us that there is 3 ways to adapt a rigid contact lens. And when I speak of rigid, I mean corneal lenses, not other lenses of such as orthokeratology or sclerals or custom designs. Within the adaptations that we saw, we can adapt a patient in 3 ways by flattening or adjusting the concept of parallelism. All of this is related to the lens with respect to the type of cornea. I have always said that I must, by an analysis, let's say that parallelism is not an adaptation criteria, because if I place this lens by adjustment and this lens fits me badly, what do? I adjust more or adjust less, increase its diameter or decrease the diameter. And if I placed a lens by flattening and the lens fits me badly, I do not flatten it more or flatten it less. And when we talk about parallelism, if I put a parallel lens and then this lens is bad for me, I do it more parallel or less parallel than this concept. Let's say no parallelism exists. It falls within a concept of either adjustment or flattening. And then we could say that there is a parallelism either by adjustment or by parallelism flattening, but this is based on the criterion. Then I am going to make a recount or comment on what these types of adaptations are. Let's say that the first criterion that was handled was the adjustment, and it was handled for many years because there were not enough materials. And let's say that at the time, as I recall and understand in the year 69 or so, they began to free themselves from the patents of the materials, because PMMA was a material that had a patent, and the patent was released and work began to use or for it to be used in the adaptation of contact lenses. Then it was the first that was handled. Because PMMA, we are not going to enter into a structure of its handling with this material, because it began to generate what we are talking about in contact lenses, because it said PMMA, or as it's known, polymethyl methacrylate. The adjustment also, it has a concept called adjustment or release of the corneal apex, where what we want is for the corneal apex to be free, and that is, if we translate it to the word of the day, increase the sagitta in the middle part of the contact lens, because we had to have a contact lens with a very small overall diameter. As for the PMMA material, its great defect was, or is, that its decay is 0, and it does not allow permeability. It is not that permeability is the panacea to make a contact lens adaptation, but today this permeability gives me many advantages, and it went back because in the history of contact lenses, PMMA was handled for many years. So since it did not have that oxygen step that we have today, which gives us too much ocular health, then these materials had to make small diameters, very small, because to find a smaller contact area of the lens with the cornea and avoid or allow this oxygenation to be peripheral through the cornea to maintain a better corneal stability, since very high adjustments had to be made in this concept. When making very high adjustments, if we come back here because the diameter has to be small, because if we cannot generate an alternation in the corneal surface within the concept of the advantages that, let's say, adapt a lens by fitting with PMMA. Adapting a lens by adjustment has several advantages. We have movement control, we have patient management, and that the lens remains centered. And let's say that this causes the sensation or that there is a decrease in the sensation of a foreign body, because the lens does not move. Therefore, by not moving the lens, since the lens generates less discomfort and disadvantages, PMMA generally generates edema. The patients that had an edema were considered almost normal. In not so high conditions, these patients generally also presented a staining 3 to 9, because as they really are lenses that were tight and the corneas had their flattest meridian, most are horizontal, because that touch there in which generates that de-epithelialization or that keratosis in this type of patients, there was a distortion. And it is a distortion of the surface cornea because the lens, when adjusted, will work as a suction, and it will cause the cornea to curve and generate a distortion of this corneal surface, making it a little more curved. So much that it was talked about at that time, not being true or not being a lie, that this could be one of the many causes of keratoconus. And due to the contact lenses being so tight that it generated this corneal deformation, there is a blurring from the use of the glasses that may happen immediately or later on. And they did not teach it for a long time that if one wanted to give glasses to the patient, they had to ask if they wanted them for now or for a while after using the contact lenses. Because if you wanted it for now, it was simply to remove the lens and take as the cornea was curved or deformed by the contact lens. That would be the refraction, but if they were going to be for then, it showed that a few days later that the cornea began to uncurve and began to alter the diopter power. And after a few days, it did not work for the patient. Let's say it was not something transcendental, and also very little was said about the designs of the contact lenses. I remember that most of the contact lens designs being small in diameter, and there were such basic designs as spherical or designs such as toric or lenticular designs, because when making the lenticular lens of such a small diameter, the patient was going to have reflex problems due to certain visual alterations. And so, on the subject of understanding a little bit about contact lenses, and one perceives it with the passing of time, and when making comparisons, when we learn and when we teach about contact lenses, sometimes we make a mistake, and it is what we teach the bad. We never teach to evaluate a lens from what do I have to see when I adapt a contact lens and how should I see it. And if I do see it, I am going to do well in the adaptation. And later on I will explain what I want to say. And the philosophical principle is that the lens is in a centered, interpalpable position. And what does it mean? That the lens stays centered and between the two eyelids. If I see this when I adapt a rigid contact lens, I say that it is a contact lens is fine, because I have seen it many times. The way to evaluate a patient adapted with the contact lens is that we want to put the lens on him, and the question is how the lens feels. And the patient says, terrible, I cannot open my eyes, says maybe this lens is not the one that I need. I feel it more or less and I feel something. But there is no criterion from us, since we have to start from something. If I see this, in principle, this is what an ideal lens looks like, and that is, it is centered between the eyelids. And if I have seen in the adaptation, but the patient tells me I feel the lens is bothering me, and I say that there is a problem, that is not the adaptation, that it is not the position of the lens, but it may be because the lens has something, or because it may be simply the adaptation process. But my criteria is to see what we can see in these adaptations. And here we are going to look at it. And this is to see that the lens is centered. It must have a certain movement, which is allowed, which is what interferes with me. That to see that the lens moves, if that contact lens does not move, here we are going to generate a problem. And I am going to repeat it, and I analyze which lens moves when blinking. And when the lens moves when blinking, if it moves, it is guaranteeing tear exchange. And this movement should not be marked or so closed. The only thing I do tell you is that the contact lens does not have movement there. If it is going to generate a problem in the patient, then we see it with the fluorogram, and we must analyze the movement from the lens. And we see the CPP, we see the central accumulation, and it accumulates in the lower part of the fitting. And I must see the movement of the lens in each blink. So when the patient blinks, if the lens moves, what am I going to see? If I say the contact lens, that the patient says that, the contact lens is bothering me, I can say if it is bothering him by an external factor, such as that it is an adaptation process, and that something, or the eye, has something then already based on that. And you can have the adaptation criteria, but what can happen, if we see here, if I put this video of this contact lens, every time that the patient blinks, he has very marked movement. So what do I say that contact lens is wrong? Because that contact lens is wrong. And what I told you many times, we get tangled up and we start looking for 1,000 things that then we make a design like that. Which is that it falls for white, for black, for blue, for red, or for anything. But we sit down to analyze the reason why the contact lens falls off. If I find the reason very easily, I have a solution. But if I don't have the solution, I will never find the reason. So we start to, as I tell you, I don't know what happens, then I say, let's make a larger diameter. It didn't work for a more curved one either. And so we must first analyze the beginning, because a contact lens that fits tightly falls. And contact lenses are not complicated because we only have two variables in this case, in which, because of the curve, which is what I adapt, or because of the diameter, right? And so I don't have so many variables to handle it. So let's identify the cause, because a contact lens falls out, firstly, because the base curve that I placed is flat, and that is not adjusted, or because the diameter is very small. Then, if I placed a flat base curve, and outside of that I place a small diameter, the lens can fall out. And if I place a normal curve but a smaller diameter, the lens can also fall. And so if I have to identify the cause, I know what the solution will be. Because the exact opposite to the curve was made flat, I'll place a more curved base, and or handle a larger diameter. I have always said that we have to start improving the adaptations based on the curve of the initial design, because it is what we have in the office. Either a test box, then we can test by putting flatter base curves, or more curves depending on the case. And the diameter is not because I cannot increase a diameter of a co-lens contact, and in the office I am not going to reduce a contact lens diameter. So we can begin to analyze them within this process in the contact lenses. Another thing that can happen is that the lens is very superior, or that it forms bubbles, and bubbles like these are called dimply unveiling, which are micro bubbles. And notice that the area of the pupil with respect to the edge of the lens is very close, and this surely in low lighting will make the patient see reflections. And here we clearly see a bubble where it is indicating that the patient will not have a good quality of vision due to this bubble. And this is a patient who wore a contact lens. And we remove and look at how the contact lens marks that cornea. And so first we have to analyze why sometimes you see a bubble. And obviously that bubble may scare us, and then what we do is remove it. And so simply follow the steps, because if a bubble is created, a bubble is an airspace, and in this case, why would there be a bubble? A bubble is an airspace between the cornea and the contact lens, and which that means that the contact lens is more curved than the cornea. And so if the contact lens is more curved, then what would be the cause, since there is a very tight base curve or a very large diameter? Then either of these two causes may be the one that is causing those bubbles, or that little movement of the contact lens. And how do we solve it? By making a much flatter base curve and decreasing its diameter. I remember that at the time when talking about PMMA materials, most adapters generally did a little bit more good. The bigger the diameter that I tell you, the bigger it moved, between 9.0 and 9.2, and sometimes 9.3. Because If the lens was very tight, they cut the diameter of the lens, and that helped the positioning of the lens to improve. And there is something very important to understand, and this is of the adjustment or the liberation of the apex. And so we ask, what is the relationship that exists between corneal astigmatism and the amount of adjustment? And here it tells us that the greater the corneal astigmatism that we have, the greater the adjustment it can give. And that the less corneal astigmatism we have, the less adjustment we can give. And this is a relationship that is very important to take into account. The greater the astigmatism, the greater the adjustment. The lower the astigmatism, the lower the adjustment. And so the adjustment is directly proportional to the corneal astigmatism. And we can also play with the larger diameter. The smaller diameter adjustment to a larger adjustment is where I can have this correlation of diameter and base curve or diameter and adjustment. I can say that the corneal astigmatism is directly proportional to fit, and that the diameter is inversely proportional to the fit. If I make a large diameter, I must adjust less, and if I make a smaller diameter, I must adjust more. Later we began to see and began to identify many types of tables to make these adaptations. That is, the corneal astigmatism of value 1 setting 0.50 and put the diameter to 93, and another said that it was 1 and the astigmatism set to 0.25 and put diameter of 9.5. Another said yes, it is 1 setting 0.75 and put a diameter of 9.0. And they began to invent a bit of tables and handling that the tables are not that they are good or that they are bad. They simply must have them as a parameter to speed up the exam a little bit and to speed up what we are doing. And I give the example, when one does a retinoscopy or a skioscopy, that one used to start from 0.25 to 0.25, and today one looks like in the shadows he is against and says that this is greater than 2, and he then begins to play with this point. But the question was, what do we consider high astigmatism? But how much is the maximum adjustment that we all use today? We say that the maximum adjustment to start a test is more or less than 1 diopter. And what we are going to adjust are 1.25 to 1.5 or whatever they want. Now I repeat that this is not a straitjacket, this is an idea of the handling. So here we have a table that represents what we stated, that when the corneal astigmatism is between 0 to 0.75, we adjust it to 0 to 0.5, and from 1 to 1.75 we adjust to 0.5 to 0.75. Same with 2 to 2.75, we adjust to 0.75 to 1, and so on. With this, what I want to state is that for me, a corneal astigmatism that is greater than 3 is high, and any other astigmatism greater than 3, I will adjust them to 1.5. If it is from 41 to 44 or greater than 3, I adjust to 1.5 or 1. If it's 41 or 46, I adjust to 1. Or if it's 42 to 47, I adjust to 1. It does not matter, because what we are going to test, trying to see what I want to see, that the lens was centered, that it has a movement, and that it remains between the two eyelids. And what I told them when the corneal astigmatism is 0, I place a lens parallel or equivalent to the flattest K. And by then here, it would be a parallelism by adjustment, because if that lens that I place parallel by adjustment falls, what do? Then I adjust it. But I am making a compensation for an adjustment in a parallelism. That, as I was telling you, it does not matter if they want to handle it from another concept. What I want, we are going to distribute from 0 to 1 of adjustment, or from 0 to 1.25 that they have. Then 1.50 is more or less half from 0 to 3 for the corneal astigmatism. That would adjust half of the 0.5 or the 0.75. And as I say that it is not a reason for stress, that it is to say how much they liked 0.5 to 0.75. A 0.25 does not generate a very marked alteration in a concept of adaptation, because they are not the margins of error that may exist in the measurements and adaptation. Then it seems, or it does not seem like it, because the concept of flattening has always existed, and the flattening appears as a criterion of the adaptation. And I can say in our country it was like in the years 79 or 1980, and that appeared because materials began to change to gas permeable materials. And it is another history of materials where they can change looking for that permeability. And then the materials change to being copolymer materials, and the evolution of materials will begin to mix with silicon and with fluorine, with Teflon and fluorine containing materials. And the laboratory equipment also had to change them. And as the industry began to change them and the concept of the designs began to be optimized. And as simple as the lenticulars within this management were, this evolution occurs because these materials as copolymers, which is a development of the materials where PMMA was, or the standard and then the modified. Then the first gas permeable material that came out due to the first material CAB, or unstable cellulose acetate butyrate. So then they went back to the PMMA matrix and started adding it. Then they ionized to mix these copolymers, and this is to improve that oxygen transmissibility a little, which then sped up the process, or let's say the evolution of these materials that we use today. And by improving the materials that we achieved and the designs of the contact lenses that we achieved, we can then start to process a larger diameter. And we could already talk about large diameters, and what I tell you is not the same to make an aspherical lens with a diameter of 10 than to make a lenticular with a diameter of 8.5, then a lenticular with a diameter of 9.5 to 9.8 to 10. And that makes the lenticle interface interfere less in the area of optics of that patient's pupil. And it will give them a greater contact area of the lens with the cornea, and they began to talk about the decrease in the adjustment. Within this, when these materials began to come out, I remember back in the day, I had a company which no longer exists, and it was called Syntex, and they released a material that had a DK of 12, which was a very good material, and it worked. And they told us, gentlemen, change the concept of the adaptation. We said, as well as the change in the concept of the adaptation, we began to handle a little flattening, because the materials helped us to protect those corneas, and the materials help us to avoid a lot of the flare-ups. And also nowadays, because very few are seen, but they also told us that what is white for the adjustment is black for the flattening. And the concepts are diametrically opposed. And when we just talk about the adjustment, well, I'll explain that further later on. And what the advantages are by working by flattening first. This is almost not sold anymore due to decipedializations in the adaptations. Unless there is an external agent that is generating it, we have a tear reservoir in the lowest part, because when the lens is adapted by the flattening, it remains raised in its lower part, and it is made into a reservoir that pumps. And there is a better design of the front face, and what I was telling them. And they began to talk about lenticulars, and they talked about it was not manufactured within the handling. And it is possible to talk about the modification of the finished entity, this in terms of positioning the lenses, not to power or to handle any of that. And it was seen that when patients passed these lenses, it worked by flattening, and they used their glasses. And the variation in vision was very little, and in general it was very stable, which disadvantages increased initial lens movement, and that this makes the patient feel. And it is very simple if I adapt the right eye by adjusting the left eye by flattening. And the patient can feel the left lens more, because the lens moves a little more, because it is not adhered, tight or curved in the cornea. The two possible expulsions are not like that, because a lens in some cases, due to astigmatism or keratoconus, between its inner part can be very raised, and it would give the sensation that the lenses are going to fall. And the third one, since it is one of the most important, is the non-application of the technique at a professional level. Because that changed, when people are handling this, they began to believe that the flattening would make larger diameters, along with the concept of adjustment. And when we talked with the colleagues about this, I asked them if they are clear about the concept of planning and everything. And then they say, if I have it clear, and the question we asked them within this process, based on what they told us, they realize that there is no clarity in this concept, and it is not that it is very difficult, because to fix an adaptation, or I flatten, or I adjust this, it does not matter what criteria we are handling. Because if I flatten when I should not flatten, and just when I should not adjust, because the adaptation is going to be a failure. The philosophical principle of flattening is a retention length of the upper right eyelid. And what does that mean, that the upper eyelid is one of the ones who retains the contact lens? Which means that if I raise this eyelid, this lens must be lowered in this part here. We see a fluorogram below, and we see a uniformity of the entity. That would be ideal, and this would be the ideal concept of adaptation, to see a slightly higher lens retained by the upper eyelid. And the important thing is to see that the area of the pupil and the lower part of the pupil is not close to the edge or transition of the lens. And this is the concept that means that when I already adapt a lens by flattening, I must look for the upper eyelid to retain the lens. And by retaining it as he is going to raise it, the adjustment is that the lens remains centered. And so when we do this, we handle it. And if we see here, this here would be the ideal concept of the contact lens. It always goes to the bottom, and that the lens has movement after blinking, and that movement causes that tear exchange to be generated. Now, notice that the lens is going to be seen above the upper eyelid. It is a lens that is going to give us the best position, and if we are going to see the fluorogram here, there you can see that the lens moves, and also a central touch. But what makes when he blinks is that the central touch he feels with tears and it vacates, because in the lower part there is a very marked reservoir of tears, and what we said before is that the reservoir will help me pump. And that tear, what I mean with this, is when I do the adaptation, it is the exact same as when we talk about the adjustment, and I see this in my concept. I will say that this is the contact lens we need. I would explain to the patient that if it is annoying, that it may be due to the adaptation process or because the lens has something inside. Because usually, if it were something that we had in the eye, we would be seeing it there. And with this, we want to say that this is the philosophical principle. That the lens stays up and that it holds by the upper eyelid. But what can happen is that if the lens does this, if I see this position of the entity that has excessive movement, the lens is not going to be retained. The lens is going to go down. And if the patient feels this, what will happen is that he will feel that he has to press his eyelids to feel less movement. And he will not feel like it is flat or that it is curved. I say it is flat because the fluorogram here is giving me a touch and shows me the central accumulation, but that lens is falling slightly on the cornea. So the question we ask is, what would be the cause for which that contact lens falls off? And most of them start to mess with designs, or with designs that I do not know. And I say, no, let's go back to the basics. What would be the cause for the base curve or for the diameter? Then we look at it. They say that the lens falls because the base curve is flat. Most of them give that answer without seeing the patient, that is, without seeing the criteria or analyzing the criteria. If this were a real situation, they would say to us that the adaptations are totally different for planning. Why? It's because if this lens falls due to flattening, the cause is because the base curve that is adjusted, or let's say less flat, or the diameter is small. But why do I say that the base curve is less flat? Because this philosophical principle, which is that the upper eyelid retains the lens. Then if the eyelid cannot reach to catch it, it is because it is curved or less flat. And being so, it does not retain it, because the lens falls. And when the lens falls, that is what will generate that annoyance, or due to the diameter being too small. But let's put that aside so as not to bring it up in the conversation for now. Now, if I say that the cause is because the base curve is adjusted, it is because that would be the solution that can make a flatter base curve, or a larger diameter, or a mixture of two. And I can solve it by making a flatter base curve, because by making it flatter, the lens will make it retain, and it will be a better or a larger diameter to find a greater contact area with each other. So note that the solution is different. Through this, I say that it is not because I see a lens that falls that I want to say that the base curve is flat, because it may be that it is flat if we are talking about the adjustment, or it may be that it is adjusted because we are talking about flattening. Then it is much easier when trying to understand the handling, and the same applies here with a different concept. And think here that this lens is very retained by the upper eyelid. And look at the edge of the lower pupil with respect to the edge of the lens. It is very close, and this will generate problems within the adaptation process, such as the lighting, or if you have made a lenticular, he may be seeing that by that transition of that lens.
Tienes una cita presencial con tu preparación académica, con los profesionales de la salud visual de América Latina, con los negocios.
Asegura tu cupo en franjafedopto2021.com inscripciones.
Enfrentando eficazmente la era digital.
And what would be the cause of that lens being so retained by flattening, that the curve is so flat, and that my eyelid does not let me close, or that in the diameter is very large? And as the solution, because with the opposite to the cause, it is because it is flat, then what do I do to make it more curved? Or if the diameter is very large, then we will decrease the diameter. Then there are two different concepts. It does not mean that one is better than the other. They are simply tastes, and they are the criteria, what makes a criterion, and what makes one person better than another in what they do. In an adaptation of lenses, one goes better with something than another, or with another, and that is what forms the criteria and the difference. And here is another different part of what we talk about flattening, which means the greater the corneal astigmatism, the less it has to be with its flattening. And the smaller the corneal astigmatism, the greater the flattening. And the larger the diameter, the greater the flattening, the smaller the diameter. And the greater the flattening, here we mean that the corneal astigmatism here is inversely proportional to the flattening. And if there's a high corneal astigmatism flattening, if there is a low corneal astigmatism, then you flatten it more. If you want to handle a large diameter, make a larger flattening. And if you want to handle a small diameter, make a smaller flattening. And it is totally different from the adjustment, as in the adjustment it was directly proportional and gave us a larger diameter and a larger adjustment. Here it is a larger diameter and smaller flattening. And so we say again, when the maximum planning that we give to diopter, when we combine it with corneal astigmatism, it is very low. And then the corneal astigmatism is low, it is not greater than the flattening, and if we are going to look at the table, not because the table is one that takes us out of doubt, no, but to make the flattening part a little bit better understood, corneal astigmatism is between 0 to 0.75. To flatten 1, but I want to flatten 1.5 because it can flatten that, and a 1.25 can flatten it, and what happens is that they try to handle something that leads us to a much easier adaptation. The same way if the astigmatism is equal to or greater than 3. Then let's say that the K parallel to the flattest of the patient, it is 4, or parallel to 5. For you, the corneal astigmatism is higher than 4, well, the table no longer works between 0 and 1. And between 0 and 1.5 or 1.25 to adjust it. But this is a concept simply to give a guide. This is not a law, nor is it done in that way. But it helps us carry out the exam. If I place a lens that had to adjust or flatten a diopter and it falls because I flatten it more, the important thing here is that the diameters of the contact lenses when we make adjustments by flattening have to be diameters greater than 9.6 to 9.7 millimeters, because I cannot make smaller diameters. Otherwise the eyelid is not going to retain the lens in the eyelids, and so we must be clear about a corneal relationship with the eyelid. There are many types of corneal eyelids, the one that is parallel to the upper part, the one that is parallel to the inside of the cornea, the one that covers a third, and that one there is not parallel. However, let's raise it and lower the eyelids as we want in the corneal relationships. I am only interested in two types of eyelids, the one that covers the upper third of the cornea and one that does not cover the upper cornea. For example, here we see that this is an eyelid that covers the upper third of the cornea. We see that right here. But what kind of adaptation could I do to both? Could I adjust it or could I flatten? The eyelid will allow it and the cornea will also allow it. But if I have this type of eyelid when the upper third is not covered, what type of adaptation could I do? In this case, we can only adjust. Why? Because if this upper eyelids hold their lens, then it is going to raise it a lot, and the patient will not be able to move it through the transition of this contact. So he will see the edge of the contact lens instead of clear vision. And I love to flatten it this way, and I like to keep it flat, believe it or not. And here, if I could not flatten, then I have to have a concept of what I should do in this type of corneas, or should I say, these types of eyelids. And that is to handle a concept of adjustment. There is also a direct relationship with the curves, because we think that when we say that we place an equal lens, here we are generating an alignment pattern, and when we position ourselves in this example, if I have two equal surfaces, we are going to call this one the cornea and this other one we are going to call the contact lens. And in the same radius of curvature, the two are superimposed, and the radius and the curvature of both here is not generating an alignment pattern, it is generating an apex release, or a small increase, where this would be associated with an adaptation by adjustment. To find that alignment pattern that I should do, if this is the cornea, and the white circle here is the largest part of the contact lens, then I must make the contact lens flatter than the corneal surface. And thus, an alignment pattern is generated here, or parallelism if you want to call it that. But look at this. This spherical lens moves away from the cornea, right? And so it gives the sensation that it is an aspherical lens. And we also know that the cornea is an aspherical surface, so it will not be so closed here, but it will also open up. And what I mean by this is that by making a lens flatter, it will have a better corneal lens ratio in its peripheral part, without the need to handle a spherical lens design. And that would be good to take into account, because when making the lens spherical, its edge will open up much more and can generate greater retention. And so, if this is in a design issue when you want to see greater retention of this contact lens, like the evaluation of these lenses, the positioning of the lens or the movement of the lens and the fluorogram. Now let's say that we have to see and always evaluate the positioning is slightly superior with the eyelid retention, or the retention of the upper eyelid. And thus we tell the patient that the lens is going to be slightly higher, because if someone tells him that the lens is seen on top, and the patient in the consultation says that I have my lens on top, we try to explain to the patient how this contact lens will be seen. And a fluorogram should be aligned and without support along with the type of cornea that we are adapting. And if the patient allows it, and its movement should be soft and moderate, while also allowing movement after each blink. And we will have to talk about numbers, 1 to 2 to 3 millimeters of the lens not moving, because if the lens does not move, then we will generate damage and we are going to generate corneal hypoxia. Remember that rigid lenses always adapt on the surface and on the float of the tear. And so there must be a space there that allows you to see that movement and that tear exchange. And this will protect the eye, and it is more or less something like this. If I see this adaptation normally in a lens by flattening, I say this is a good lens and that it is slightly retained by the upper eyelid. But it can go up a little more if you want it retained by the upper eyelid with a position that isn't covering the corneal area. In principle, these are basic concepts of contact lens adaptation, because nowadays we are playing with too many designs, and we have gone from not adapting corneal lenses to adapting lenses of special designs. And we talk about sclerals, and we talk about orthokeratology, and about managing thousands of contact lenses, but these are the basics, and it is what we are going to use to teach how to adapt contact lenses. And what we must remember to better our adaptations is to learn step by step. There is no winning lens, otherwise we would already be adapting rigid contact lenses. And there are 1,000 brands of contact lenses, there are 1,000 designs, 1,000 concepts, 1,000 handlings, but I believe that if one understands the basic of contact lenses, then they can already manage these adaptations along with a better understanding of these modifications. And that is what they want to implement along the way, along with the values that they will have to create and manage in the adaptation. Once again, I'd like to thank Contamac and Carlos Mayoral for this invitation to Class 2021, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you very, very much for your time today, and have a good evening.